Well, I'm Robert Nicastro, and this is WCAT Radio. I thought you'd like to know. This afternoon, I'm sitting down with Father Joseph Bracken, and we'll be discussing his new book, Reciprocal Causality in an Event-Filled World. And Father Joe, before we begin getting into the nitty-gritty of your book, I think the audience might be interested in knowing that you are, in fact, a Catholic priest and a Jesuit, and you got interested in this business of process theology, which isn't necessarily something that many Catholics would get into. So why did you find process theology attractive?
Well, let me put it this way. I have two, if you will, a more limited view and a deeper view. The limited view starts out with the idea that we are facing an environmental crisis, but people shrug their shoulders and say, well, it's not my problem, or it's too big for me to handle, and so on. So what I'm saying is we need a new world view that will motivate us to seek the common good as our own good in the first place. So it's not self-interest, but interest in the other and the survival of the other that really counts. It's like what you hear at a funeral homily. People talk about what a good person that was and what he or she did and so on and so forth. But the problem that it exists is that we're not ready to accept the fact that we're moving into a new age where we're focusing more and more not on things, individual things, but on organized groups of entities, individual entities, following a pattern of operation or a governing structure of some kind. And as a result, what we're trying to do is to come up with a non-dual as opposed to instead of the principle of non-contradiction, it's either this or that, it's both this and that. So what we're trying to really get our hands on is a theory which tells us how things move, not how they stay the same, but how they move. In the ancient world and in the medieval world, the focus was on the permanent structures of society and people living their lives within a set of laws, principles, and so forth, that you knew pretty much how things are going to go from one generation to the next. We're beyond that now, with the evolutionary theory developing as it is, and we're more into process. But the process alone, simply activity alone, is not enough. It just like in the catechism for little kids, see Dick run. Yeah, so right. You're connecting together not only an entity, but an activity at one and the same time. Just for example, in old-time movies, you never really see yourself moving. You see kind of shots of yourself, and they move through them faster and faster to give the illusion of movement. Whereas Whitehead is saying, no, the movement is actually there. But because the movement is based upon history, not upon permanent possession, but what was true in the past is not totally true anymore in the present, and it certainly won't be totally true in the anticipated future. So you have to study the social location of yourself vis-a-vis what you're trying to talk about. The old problem of universal concepts, which was developed so highly by Thomas Aquinas, among others, was beautiful. But at the same time, there's a suspicion that you never really got to the individual. And the Franciscan authorities like Bonaventure and Duns Scotus and so forth, they saw that somehow describing somebody as a man or a woman is just the start. What you have to look at is the person in his or her history, at least up to that point. And when you do that, you get a much better picture of an individual as someone that's becoming. Aristotle, in his own way, had the same issue, and he put it paradoxically. He said, movement or change is the actuality of something still in potentiality. Try to think that one through, and the only way to do that is to have both the sense of being an entity and an ongoing activity at one and the same time. And that fits so beautifully with systems. And systems have become the name of the game in the life sciences for the sake of for solving issues like the emergence of life from non-life, or mental life from just neuro or short-term life, so to speak. And the trouble is that they're prescinding from the possibility of the influence of God, so that they don't have to deal with the further religious questions of, is God responsible? Is chance responsible? They just stick to what they know works, which is that there is an ongoing process that keeps moving along, and you have to study where it's going. And that's the beauty of that idea is taking over in the life sciences. And all what I'm saying is, look, for Pete's sake, this is how we can finally get around to talking sensibly about the social doctrine of the church.
Right.
All the popes have come out with their encyclicals on social justice, but do we preach them? No, we don't. You might offend this person or that person. So we preach the commandments instead of saying, here's the historical situation, and let's deal with it as something that is really going on, as opposed to appealing to an abstract set of principles, commandments, whatever you want to call them, and just repeating the obvious: don't have sex with somebody else's wife, don't steal, don't kill anybody, and so on and so forth. It's and the beauty of John or the Laudato Si, John the 23rd, is he saw that. He saw that he wasn't going to be able to preach customary morality in dealing with an environmental crisis, so he appealed to systems and presumably got people that are familiar with systems theory to help him out. But we've got to dig deeper and create a kind of a metaphysics of becoming, so that it's not just simply being versus nothing, but being and nothing. In between is becoming. We need a logic of becoming that will ultimately shape us to see the historical character of reality going on around us. And there's really no reason not to accept that on the part of the church, because if you have activity, you also have to have an underlying entity to supply the energy from moment to moment. And that's God, or I would say, the three divine persons already setting up structures that we unconsciously won't just discover. But it's like, for example, with an airplane, they had to get a machine that could go fast enough to understand the law of aerodynamics and to get the lifts so they could fly. Now where are we?
Right.
So it was there, but we didn't see it until we got all the parts in place, and then all of a sudden, flying became a very routine thing, at least until recently. But the big thing is that the church has got to, as I see it, has got to accommodate to kind of a tentativeness, because it's historical and could change, but also search for enduring principles that will guide you in determining ever new situations. And John the 23rd had it in his hands, and the scientific community was basically very impressed that finally the Pope wasn't talking scholastic language, but scientific language in describing the problems of the modern world. At least that's how I diagnose the thing. It's exciting, because if we do have a logic of becoming, so that it's not either or, but both and that opens us up, of course, to the partiality of our own understanding of reality, but it also keeps us honest that everybody has something to contribute. So we're really into kind of a consensus approach to truth more than a classical correspondence approach to truth, because nobody has the whole picture at any given time. So it's mind-blowing when you start thinking along those lines, and I have a section on systems theory as a scientific thing from a notable environmental ethician, Holmes Ralston in Colorado State, and then I introduce my own understanding of a Christian a set of principles, structured realities, where kind of a hierarchy of becomings, where they're layered after infrastructure and superstructure condition one another. That's where the reciprocal causality comes in. So you don't have causation coming simply from the top down, from God or somewhere else, but you have causation from the bottom up, whereas the parts are co-determining the structure at the same time as they are being affected by the structure that they just put into place. That's reciprocal causality, which allows you to finally get your hands around a logic of becoming. Am I making any sense?
Joe, you're making fantastic sense, and certainly I agree with everything, and I appreciate that very thorough overview. Let's just peel apart some of the content that you mentioned, because some people, especially within the church, would critique a systems-oriented approach to not only the world but to God, because it seems very deterministic. Certainly, I don't think so, and it doesn't sound like you don't think so, but how would you respond to that criticism?
Well, in the minds of many scientists, it is deterministic. Some of them more notable life scientists like Stuart Kaufman, Terence Deacon, Jesper Hoffmeyer, and so forth, they don't have parts that function for the sake of the whole, as well as the whole affecting the self-formation of the parts, their interplay with one another. You've got to have back and forth reciprocity, equivalently intersubjectivity, but not just on the human scale, even on the subatomic scale. So all entities, it's a question of the one and the many. Do you want the one to dominate the many? You're going to have permanence, because the one is setting up the rules of the game. But if you want a logic of becoming, you have to let the parts contribute to the whole, and yet out of the interplay of the parts with one another, a new whole, a new structure starts to emerge, which in turn affects the way the parts function again. It's like your own body. When we're a whole set of hierarchically ordered systems, from the tiniest microbes and so forth up to the functioning of the mind. And body and mind are correlated so that they're conditioning one another. And for many of the scientists, that means we don't have to worry about the soul. No, the soul is really the unifying principle that keeps pulling things together after they seem to fall apart, pull them back together again. And the function of God is to incorporate us into the eternal life of the Spirit, but with an open-ended quality, so that we are free to say no as well as to say yes. Eventually, we pay for that in terms of pain and suffering for ourselves and others. But it's like a parent tutoring a child to use a bicycle. You're going to fall a couple of times, but that's the only way to ever learn how to use the bicycle. So that's where God says, okay, you ignored what I was suggesting to you by way of an impulse, a desire, and so on. Let's try something else instead. The classic example of that I've used in classroom presentations for undergrads is the rabbi who wrote "When Bad Things Happen to Good People." Marvelous book. The same basic idea. God isn't punishing you. You're punishing yourself. And God is just saying, well, now you've learned a lesson. Let's start over again.
That's a really wonderful example, and you're already bringing up a monumental difference between a classical metaphysical framework and a more process-oriented framework, that God does not coerce, but God persuades.
Exactly right. Exactly right. God does not coerce, force. God persuades. And God is very patient.
As we can see so clearly looking out our windows. But what also sounds as if you're saying, Joe, I mean, first of all, reciprocal relationship is the name of the game. That's
it is. Everything is connected with everything else. So the old point of chaos theory was a little ripple in one part of the world can create a tsunami somewhere else over a period of time. Nothing is totally by itself. Everything is interconnected. And of course, the beauty of it is that's how you really should explain the Trinity. Right. You have three divine processes, person processes, that are collaborating in being one God. So their unity is arising out of their integrated activity with one another. So you don't have God the Father doing one thing, God the Son doing something else, and God the Spirit doing a third thing. That's tritheism, basically, as Ronner saw. Basically, all three are involved in creation, in redemption, and sanctification. It's a conjoint effort for the three of them to do everything together.
And what's interesting about that is that's Ronner was, as a neo-Thomist, trying to bridge the old metaphysical paradigm with a new evolution.
That's right.
But at the same time, it was too much. It sounds like he chose to collapse the difference between the immanent Trinity and the economic Trinity, but you're choosing to hold the difference.
Right. Right. A good friend of mine was Catherine Lacuna, but she was very upset when I said to her, basically, if you reduce everything to how God comes across to you in your own personal life, how sure are you really that you're not hallucinating? There's got to be a difference between what you have to have a giver before you can accept a gift. The giver is there, and you have to deal with the nature of the giver in relation to the person being given the gift. But it's still a two-way street. But still, there is a giver there, and it's not just, this is how I feel about things.
Right. So God can actually, it sounds like you're saying that in this reciprocal relation, God is certainly a system that is unto itself, but also is, as a divine matrix, grows with the parts that
Exactly right. Exactly right. Basically, we came from the divine life by an act of creation with something like the Big Bang, and we're growing. We burst into zillions of particles with the Big Bang, and we're slowly but surely coalescing more and more to achieve the unity, which will end up being eternal life. So we'll just how that would work is still a mystery to us, but it's not that Jesus is the end game, but the cosmic Christ, something like Teilhard's cosmic Christ, is the end game. Christ as himself, part of the divine system, saying, "Come on in. You'll enjoy it, because you've learned the hard way how hard it is to be on your own."
Right, and that's certainly, it's not limited to the person of Jesus of Nazareth, but it's certainly modeled in his life.
It does. Jesus is, the way I put it in one of the books I wrote, and Niels Gregerson, who just recently died, commented on, he said, "Joe, what you're saying is the incarnation began with the Big Bang."
Right. Yes.
Jesus is the key moment when somehow that turns, it's the universe has come together enough to allow for a two-natured person called Jesus. And at times it's the divinity that shows itself more. Other times it's the humanity that shows itself more. But that's because these processes keep conditioning one another.
Right, and you know, I guess the question that maybe some would have is, what about God's self-identity is essential? Is that, in terms of a Whiteheadian system, creativity? Or is it love? Is there a difference between the two? How would you describe them?
I would say creativity is Whitehead's word, but basically what creativity comes down to is creating newness out of creating unity out of diversity.
Mm-hmm.
And but it has to be an ongoing process, and that's really what, when two people fall in love, it only works if they go from being a separate I and a separate thou to a we who are making coordinate decisions. They'll fall apart if they do not rise to being a we. And then they have kids, and the we becomes even more complex with a family of parents and children, and so forth. If we had a we on the level of Democrats and Republicans, we'd finally get something done in Washington. But that's another story.
Right. But that's really what you're saying, though, that life begins with a we-ness. It begins with
That's right.
an inherent relatedness, and if only we could grow into that kind of co-constitutive relatedness, we actually would have a better and more thriving existence, not only in the present moment, but constructing a better future as a result.
That's right. That's right. It's mind blowing when you start thinking about it, that we're moving towards something that would be like what Raimundo Panikkar, the great Hindu Christian theologian, said. I was born as a Hindu from my father, inherited Christianity from my mother, became unhappy with the tension between the two, turned to Buddhism, and eventually came back as still a Christian. The flow of different streams of tradition and ritual should really flow together, rather than be seen as running up against one another.
And right, and if this is really incarnation all the way down, and
that's right.
You suggest that creativity is that in the classic Whiteheadian maxim, the principle by which many become one and are increased by one. I think that increased by one is really the important part of this whole.
That's right. That's it exactly. Yes, indeed. That's what it is.
And so I guess the question is, too, this common element that you speak about, one could also, in a Teilhardian sense, argue that that's just the basis of love, pulling us together to create greater relationships as a result of our coming together in the first place, that identity is not lost, it's enriched because we are parts coming together to enhance the whole.
Right. On the other hand, if you were a Buddhist and you believed in absolute emptiness, it's a different way to say, I don't have an independent self.
Right. Yeah.
Emptiness in its own way is a negation of a self that's getting in the way.
And I think the myth of rugged individualism hasn't helped us at all either.
Right.
Especially in the American society. And arguably, it really is probably a pseudo-myth, if nothing else. It really was more of a zeitgeist of a time than really part of the Christian democratic principles on which this country was based.
Yes, indeed. Indeed.
And, you know, I guess in terms, too, because your book, in a way, gets at Christian doctrinal principles, particularly resurrection as a pattern of existence, a pattern of personality and memory that gets preserved. So even though we wouldn't believe in the resurrection of a physical body per se, there is certainly still a physicality of who we are that gets preserved in the divine mind. I think that would be Whitehead's consequent nature. In terms of environment and in terms of relationships among other ecosystems, animals, etc., would they also be preserved in that divine mind with the understanding that everything is incarnational?
Yes, I think so. To be honest, I really think that the three divine persons, part of it was a risk for themselves of using a cosmic process to produce really independent person-like beings, and yet they enjoyed it. They, in their own way, they wanted the experience of pain, and they taught us how to deal with it, not to see pain as something to be tolerated or an evil, but it's a purifying process that eventually gives you the right orientation to life if you live through it in a responsible way.
I think even Bonaventure said there is no other way to God than through the burning love of the crucified, right?
That's right.
That's part of
It's St. John of the Cross,
yeah.
right there.
And I guess that also wouldn't be unfamiliar to even Paul, the resurrection of the body. Being influenced by Stoic philosophy, he certainly didn't hold to a physical resurrection necessarily.
Right. Well, the big thing is, when did Mary Magdalene recognize Jesus? When he said to her, Mary. She didn't see him until he'd said her name. So she needed the intersubjective relationality to spring back in, and all of a sudden he was there.
Right. And then even at the right, and I guess the recognition then of Christ in all elements of creation too, when we really begin to relate on that divine human level, and I think that's what you're calling for too, a new altruism that is based in this kind of relatedness, this co-constitutive societies.
That's right. Yeah, it's well, actually, Hegel said that, the master-slave thing. Marx put it in the context of social justice context, but basically, eventually, the slave dominates the master, provided. Or put it this way, the only way they just keep reversing the roles is for the two of them to say, we're equals.
Right.
We're working together.
And you're mentioning social justice and how we, I think, actualize those aims to the best degree. Many theologians today, in order to do so, at least from a theological perspective, a theological paradigm, are moving away from a logos Christology to a spirit Christology. And while I think you would argue, or if I've read this in your new book and others, that a spirit Christology is not necessarily a wrong way or a poor way to go, but it's still missing some of the elements of the new metaphysical paradigm of evolution, right, biological systems, quantum, etc.
Right. Once you allow for both and instead of either or, the door is open to it picking up insights from all different quarters.
And didn't even Whitehead argue that we need, at some point, we need to stop casting aspersions on our differences, but work together to seek after the common truth?
Yes, I think so. He basically, as I see it, Whitehead himself saw that science alone will not move us forward. Only religion and science working together will solve the problems of our age. That's there in the Science in the Modern World, one of the later chapters.
Yeah, and his idea that unless religion changes as the same spirit as the science, with the same spirit as the science, its principles kind of become corrupted, and they're only meant to be eternal. And
that's right.
They change precisely so they don't lose their illuminative value, which is interesting. I know that many theologians today are suspect of changing the paradigms out of an Aristotelian Thomistic metaphysics into this new process metaphysics because they think that science somehow predominates. But I think really what you're saying is that there's not only a mutuality, but theology still takes care of the higher order while science takes care of the, quote, lower order, right? I mean,
yeah.
Science can't deal with questions of value, meaning, purpose, so theology only complements them in their pursuit toward truth.
Right. There's a wonderful book by a retired professor out at Claremont School of theology, Granville Henri. He said, let's face it, the book is titled The Images of Science, The Images of Science and Religion, some or words to that effect. He said, basically, every religion finds a way to incorporate its religious beliefs in the governing understanding of the world. This is the best science of the day. The problem arises when we baptize one system, scientific approach, like, geocentrism versus heliocentrism, and then we're caught short, and we feel that somehow the scientists don't understand us, or they want to get rid of us, and so on. No, just stay with what the scientists show you about these new insights into reality, and all of a sudden it'll hit you like a ton of bricks. We could do that in theology.
Right.
We could have a systems-oriented theology that would be very well respected by scientists because it's using their technology for a further purpose.
Right, and it would change to probably a significant degree our most cherished theological doctrines. For instance, God is no longer simple but differentiated unity in this new system.
That's right. That's right. The big thing is what you want is unity. Spirit is the unity arising out of the interplay of parts with one another.
Right.
That gives us the right attention to the fact that it's not that spirit dominates matter, and that sets up a dualism, but that spirit arises out of matter, properly organized.
And again, that would be consonant with Teilhard de Chardin's law of consciousness, which I think even the preeminent biologist David Sloan Wilson at Binghamton University is starting to acknowledge more and more that Teilhard was on to something here, and
that's right.
As a result, if it's all spirit infused and spirit is kind of becoming more transparent as consciousness rises, then we need to take this whole ecological community of creation very seriously. And it makes us doubly responsible for its cultivation, not necessarily stewardship, because stewardship is more one-directional, but it's co-cultivation.
Right.
Which brings me to somebody like Terence Deacon, who is a brilliant, I would say, scientific materialist, but he doesn't acknowledge that life begins on the lowest level of atoms. Only at a certain point does consciousness begin to interrupt the flow. It doesn't erupt, it interrupts the flow. And I'm wondering to what degree, though, his insights could still be valid and valuable in your paradigm.
Well, again, as I see it, if you want an evolutionary kind of logic, a logic of becoming, one thing should evolve out of another. There should be something that is relatively stable but still changing and producing structures that in themselves constrain or limit what you can do or not do. So really, Marx wasn't, he was basically arguing that we should take matter, that which is there, empirically there, and study it carefully, because the only way to really make progress is to stay in the empirical world, but to address it in a way where it's allowed to develop on its own.
And I think constrain here, Joe, is the sacred word.
Yes.
And
Yes, that's right.
and constrained in between and among these different societies is what actually allows that relationality to happen with integrity, correct?
That's right.
And some might argue, well, aren't we limiting God's freedom? But we can certainly look to the scriptures to see how relatedness and true relatedness necessarily gives up freedom. I mean, we have only to look at God's covenantal relationship with Israel and the new covenant with Christ. The minute
That's right.
God makes a promise, God necessarily is limited.
That's right. That's right. We limit God as much as, almost as much as God limits us, you know. Again, that's a tease, but basically, it was a risk, but still, obviously, for the divine persons, a worthy risk to produce creatures that were fully responsible for their own lives and the lives of other people. That's a marvelous aim for a world of creation.
True love to the finest extent possible.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
I'm curious, to what degree do we have a responsibility to God?
Well, put it this way. If you're into an intersubjective relationship, you assume a responsibility for the other. You may not always like what they want, but a parent can't just say to a kid, get out of the house, I never want to see you again.
Right.
You've caused me a lot of pain, you're not worth it. You can't do that. So co-responsibility is the name of the game. And that's why love hurts as well as provides joy.
So this, and you keep emphasizing, which I think is important, the idea of co-responsibility, co-relationship. So no longer, no longer than.
Oh, that's what I had in mind. Think of a woman who she's got to deal with an alcoholic husband in a loving way, because otherwise he will get mad and leave her, and so on and so forth.
And this also then raises the question, God can no longer be held responsible for any acts of evil in the world if there's a co-responsibility involved.
That's right. That's where, I'm forgetting his name now in England, but in a certain sense, he justifies animal immortality. He says they've suffered almost as much as humans, so why can't they enjoy eternal life? There's something to be said for that.
That's right. The process of evolution was pretty fierce before it reached a level of the self-thinking mind.
Right.
So, and also, you know, what you're saying too is to backtrack a bit back to what is Trinity for you and how is Trinity operative in the world, that God is infinite potentiality, that all of the potentials for actualization.
Right.
Exist in God. They're not, I mean, creation itself, right, was a potential for God. It wasn't actual until it was actual.
That's right. Yeah, we have focused on God as supremely actual, but then what I've retorted is that, well, then God's dead. God's not changing anymore. God's dead. You've turned him into an abstract concept. But really, it's the potentiality of God to turn good out of at least apparent evil.
Right.
That's the real potentiality in life.
And again, you know, just to kind of put a clarification on this, we're not saying that God causes evil or that God is responsible for evil. But could one say that if all potentials exist in God, that at least the potential for evil also exists in God?
Well, put it this way. the how would I? Carl Jung had Christ and the devil as counterparts.
Mm-hmm.
Good spirit and the evil spirit. I think there is, so it's not a potentiality for evil, but a recognition that we take 2 steps forward, but we inevitably take 1 step back.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, in other words, there are spirits and there are spirits, and that's where you have something like the Ignatian discernment of spirits. There's a spirit abroad who doesn't have a tail. It looked like a monkey, but there's a spirit abroad which drives people to do very bad things.
Right.
They get lost in the tug of belonging to something where they can make something happen. Got to be careful. What is it you want to make happen? In that sense, we should be pragmatists, not just simply idealists. Idealism has a way of crushing people who get in the way of your understanding of idealism.
Right, and even God is not an idealist, right, in the strictly Platonic sense.
Right. God, maybe put it this way, and I think this is in Buber as well. When a man and a woman say to one another, I do, the third party is the Holy Spirit. So that's where the energy will come to get through the inevitable troubles of life.
And I think what you're saying here too is that spirit as the third party is the superstructure, the unifying force, right?
That's right.
And that comes right out of your new metaphysical paradigm. And
right.
Again, just to emphasize that superstructure doesn't just exist in terms of human relationships, but is found all the way down again to the first moment of life.
That's right. There's always a balance between structure and activity. An entity, at least a slowly evolving entity with its governing structure and the dynamic interplay of the parts to keep changing the evolving structure.
Right. So
that's the logic of becoming.
So, and what's important here too is you're also saying that the world of nature too plays an integral part as the infrastructure of the spirit.
That's right. If you don't interact with your environment, you're dying.
Yeah. So in terms of this paradigm, where do we go from here as a humanity? I mean, certainly building, it seems to me like we would need to revisit the way we structure our institutions and the way we think and the way we act toward one another, and certainly the way the church articulates the God principles in the midst of it all.
Right. Well, the basic principle for me is start from the bottom up. In other words, real change will not begin, for the most part, in a council of all the bishops and so forth in Rome. Real change will start at the parish level.
Right.
It'll take time to trickle upwards, but that's where the real changes will take place to either keep people loyal to the church or allow people to drift away from the church.
And maybe just to emphasize this too, Joe, what you're saying now, it seems to me, is not only does evolution take place on the local level, but in terms of science, but this is also basic to our principle of subsidiarity within the church.
That's right. Again, that in its own way, that fits in with the principle of subsidiarity. The only difference is subsidiarity also lends itself to top-down almost a little too much. The bishop now telling the parishes, do this, do that, and the other thing. Bottom-up means at least every bishop should have a council of lay advisors and not just other pastors. Find out what's really going on in the parish.
So are you hopeful then, just as a natural extension, are you hopeful for this synodal process? Do you think that will affect necessary change, or will it just merely be a foot in the door that requires more multiple actual entitative movements?
Well, we'll put it this way. For whatever it's worth, and I'm not thinking that I'm suddenly become the second Thomas Aquinas or anything like that, but it always takes time for a new set of ideas to slowly sink in and take over. Mm-hmm. I'll be long gone before it's over.
Well, we hope not.
Well, when you're my age, you don't anticipate living too much longer.
Well, we still need to get 3 or 4 more good books out of you.
We'll see. We'll see.
But to your point, quickly, to your point, I think you're speaking right to the core content of your new book, that because we are humans, any kind of design of a human system has temptation to construct it in ways that merely advantage the individuals of that system, of that institution, and not so much for the common good. Right.
Well, see, again, everything has a good side and a not so good side. And real wisdom comes from recognizing both what would work and something that would really be bad for everybody concerned. Discernment of spirits is a reality.
Yeah, and especially during this time of Advent, when we're literally birthing the Christ anew, we need to remember that how we're discerning within this new paradigm is not just a restoration of the old, but it is a renewal. And it's bringing alive the Christ now, not only in the midst of our own lives, but in the midst of the greater creation that gave rise to us, and as a result to which we have a greater responsibility.
That's right.
So I think the key point here is that we are living in a divine matrix, and the matrix, it not only is the source of our becoming and the source of our relatedness, but through the deepening of relationships, it also grows and expands. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts, that old Gestalt principle.
Always greater than the sum of its parts.
Yeah.
But also the parts are necessary.
Right. They serve to enrich the whole.
Right.
Well, so thank you so much for your time. I hope that people will take the opportunity to really dig deeper into your new book, Reciprocal Causality, Living in an Event-Filled World, and will appreciate that it's all about relationships and a rise of greater consciousness for the greater good.
I certainly hope so, too. I'd be very pleased.
Well, thank you, Joe, for your time and speaking with me.
My pleasure. Happy to talk to you.